Good evening again. It's good to see y'all. So, every Tuesday, hundreds of people stream up Nob Hill from every neighborhood in San Francisco to participate in what has become, we think, the largest continuous yoga practice in Northern America, maybe in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's definitely Grace's largest spiritual gathering during any point of the week. I usually offer a brief welcome and a short reflection at the start, and Darren Main, who will be speaking here on August 22nd, leads us in the practice. I have come to look forward to that moment, that night, I think as much as anyone who's actually practicing there as well. But I have to admit, I'm also in the extreme minority when it comes to religious affiliation. Of the nearly 700 who gather each Tuesday, less than half identify with a particular spiritual or religious tradition, and a third of them identify as spiritual but not religious. And sociologists and church data geeks and other people like that sometimes like to refer to spiritual but not religious as SBNR, and you'll hear me use that term a little bit throughout tonight. It may be tempting to dismiss this as a kind of temporary trend. I hear that a lot actually in church circles. This is just a slight downward, we're going to come back. The main line is going to come back. But the metadata confirm this picture. The Pew Research Center published a report on the shifting American religious landscape in 2014, and the biggest story of that report was the staggering decline, 7.8% in mainline church affiliation. That's people like us, Episcopalians, Methodists, Catholics, that kind of thing. And equally staggering, an increase of 6.7% of the population that no longer affiliates with any kind of religious tradition at all. Now, those kinds of fluctuations in a 7-year period aren't just like a curious data point for people who are really interested in things like statistics. They actually point to a revolution that's happening right under our very own noses here and now. And so I think it really deserves much more attention than, frankly, most of the church is giving it. And San Francisco is often called the land of the future. And it is nowhere more the land of the future than I think it is here. The vast majority of our city are also unaffiliated. If you ask people in the street what they believe in, you're much more likely to hear energy or karma, following your bliss, those kinds of things, right? And we do yoga at work, we go to Spirit Rock and Burning Man, we spend completely unjustifiable amounts of money at places like Esalen. We do many, many things and go to great lengths to follow our bliss. We opt out of church and synagogue, even the mosque, taking to the Marin Headlands instead for hikes on the hills. We were SBNR before SBNR was a thing. So I think we know something about it. So for the next 6 weeks, the Vine is going to go all in on spirituality. And my hope for us during this time is that we might begin to answer questions, or at least form a framework to answer those questions ourselves, like basic questions like, what is spirituality? And what happens when we kind of move beyond the buzz, right? And I think for us especially, are there ways in which these ancient sources of wisdom in the Jewish and Christian tradition can be in conversation with things like yoga and meditation and sound healing and other contemporary expressions of spirituality? And so we begin tonight with these two very familiar stories from the Bible: Joseph and the great famine in Egypt, and Jesus feeding the 5,000. Where the magicians of Pharaoh's court failed, Joseph, an unassuming Hebrew slave boy, succeeds. And it does actually seem magic, doesn't it? Basically at every level. Magic that he ends up there in the first place, magic that he's believed, magic that he comes out with the right answer. Our story begins with him interpreting a dream. And I kind of love that because it's almost a cliche of the mystical powers sought out after by those who want to consider themselves spiritual adepts. There's something sort of quintessentially SF almost about that idea. I have to admit, there was a time in my own life when I saw people who wanted to pursue the spiritual, kind of new age, that sort of thing, aspiring yogis, as just wannabe Miss Cleos. Do you remember her? Remember? call and get you a free reading today? Yeah, she was later disgraced as a charlatan for engaging in consumer fraud, which was unfortunate. But I always admired Miss Cleo because she knew that if you threw together a colorful costume and a calypso accent, white people couldn't resist their urge to orientalize. And we did. They couldn't resist exoticizing a black girl from LA because they were hungry for easy answers to life's hard questions. They didn't want to do the work. They rather just come up with something quick. Joseph was the exotic other in our story too. We have to remember that. In Pharaoh's court, he was not an Egyptian. He stood out. But Joseph's apparent power to interpret the dream, the subsequent flattery and favor lavished on him by Pharaoh, belie the pragmatic messages about the nature of spiritual practice that we see here. And I want to share that with you. Basically, and I think most importantly, the mystical always gives way to the practical. And the practical consists not in puffing ourselves up with esoteric spiritual claims, but in the ordinary work of making a plan and of sticking to it. Scripture has this weird way of compressing time, but I want you to just take a moment and think about it. Think of the last 7 years of your life. 7 years. We're talking about 7 years of pretty intense tedium. Once Joseph devises a strategy to deal with the famine, his years are spent administering the system, building granaries, counting crops, allocating 20% to surplus, measuring the progress, monitoring for corruption. It has to be the sexiest story ever told about bureaucracy, the day that bureaucracy saved the world. And it's probably the only place that story is ever told. But that's just it. Spirituality is nothing if not disciplined. And we often don't like to hear that, but it's true. Literally, spirituality is nothing if not disciplined. One of my roommates at Harvard used to say that if you went to a party in the yard, half the people there claimed to be writers, but they would never have anything to really show for it. He used to say, if you want to be a writer, you have to actually write. And I thought, that kind of has a point, actually. And I think the same is true of yoga, of prayer, of meditation, of church. And this is why we call these things spiritual practices. We must practice them if we wish to be formed by them. And that discipline, I think, is actually made more difficult, ironically, by a culture of sort of superficial spirituality, right? A culture that often pays lip service to spirituality for maybe the very wrong reasons, where spirituality has actually been commodified. It's become kind of a buzzword to market everything from food to fitness, right? And I just want to encourage you, pay attention this week. As you walk through the city, think about where do spirituality words come up in your everyday lives? And what is the message that they're trying to sell? Or what is the message they're trying to communicate to you? Marketing relies on an emotional quick fix. But the first and most basic truth about spirituality is that it cannot work on our most deeply held affections, habits, and worldviews if we don't practice our practice, even when we don't feel like it. Which, frankly, if you're like me, is most days. And let's be honest, things like yoga always feel so much better after the fact. It's one of the big problems of spiritual practice. So first things first, we have to be like Joseph. We have to make a plan. We have to stick to it. We have to measure our progress. It may not be as exciting as achieving out-of-body experiences or seeing visions of Mary, of manipulating chakras or reading tarot cards, saying novenas, or even getting a rush off of our favorite worship song. I'm guilty of that. But when the famine comes, and this is really important, frippery and fanfare will not save us. You can't really fake it till you make it through a famine. So, are any of you fans of Naked and Afraid? No? Okay. It's one of my favorite shows, and I feel really guilty admitting that here, but I think it's kind of important because it also teaches some crucial lessons. And this reminds me when I was a child and used to try to convince my parents to let me watch He-Man because there was always a lesson at the end, but I think I was paying attention to other things. The thing about that show, Naked and Afraid, the thing that I think really intrigues people, we get drawn in by the way that famine strips away all pretense. In the face of deathly hunger, our exalted opinions about ourselves simply no longer matter. Famine strips away all our dignity, right? When gut-groaning hunger pains begin to set in, beggars just can't be choosers. You will eat anything to stay alive, and that's part of the entertainment of the show. You see people eat really gross things. And famine strips away the unwise. The magicians of the court are called out, because only those who discerned the coming famine and prepared are actually saved. I think we love Naked and Afraid because it's a metaphor for how most of us experience moving through our lives as lonely exiles from the primordial garden, forced to confront the animal appetites that left unchecked may lead to our fall, not just once upon a time, but here and now. Today's story is a very strange story for many reasons. Egypt is transformed from its typical role in the scriptures as the arch-villain of Israel into the very vessel of divine providence and justice. And flipping that, Joseph's 11 brothers, who stand for the other 11 tribes of Israel, are the actual villains. They have sold him into slavery out of sheer jealousy at a vision he had earlier in his life. If our spirituality is real, deep, and authentic, we must be prepared for God to sweep away even our most cherished assumptions and to turn our world upside down. The story of Joseph is a shocking reminder that our God is the God of all, even of our enemies, and that this same God desires their redemption and will even use them to save the world. It's a powerful image. But even stranger still, the story of Joseph saving Egypt casts Pharaoh as God, which is really weird because half of Genesis is like God inveighing against Pharaoh and encouraging people not to see him as God. But here, he speaks to Joseph as God speaks to the first human couple. See, I have set you over all Egypt. That's what he tells Joseph. Do you hear? Do you hear the echo? See, I have given you every tree, right? Every plant to eat. I have given you everything upon the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, and subdue it. Our purpose, even our deepest spiritual purpose, is not simply to gaze at our navel all day from the very beginning, from the very start of things. We have work to do, and that work has to do with our unique place as viceroys in the house of God that we call creation. The earth is a kind of cosmic palace. And the first couple, Adam and Eve, are really depicted as those who are entrusted with the care of that holy and sacred place. In the same way that Pharaoh entrusts Egypt to Joseph's care, God charges the first humans with this unique responsibility to steward this great creation he has just made. Our spirituality must never exist solely to serve our own needs. Jesus turns to his disciples when they tell him that the crowd is hungry, and what does he say to them? You feed them. You feed them. The story of Jesus is the story of God trying to get us to remember our original place in the order of things. You feed them. The parallels between this story and the first story of creation, though, don't stop there. If you might have noticed that little word prevail that also comes up. Did you notice that? It's a word that also comes up in the first chapters of Genesis. When the water prevails upon the earth, Noah and his family, along with the animals, were gathered together in the ark. They had built the ark because God gave Noah a dream foretelling that the great flood would come. He heard God. He received a vision, a lot like Joseph. But here at the end of the same book, it isn't rain that prevails upon the earth. It is unrelenting sun. And the ark is a granary. You feed them. Spirituality and intertextuality go hand in hand. Pay attention to those words and moments, those images and forms in your life that keep on popping up in different areas. Often when people say spirituality, what they really mean is the ability to make connections of meaning across a broad field of experience or insight. In our yoga practice, Darren often encourages us to remember that we've been here before. The point of the asanas is not necessarily to elicit a unique experience, but actually to bring us to the point of experience that we've known for many other parts of our lives, but it's just embodied in a particular way. We can only hope to recondition our response when we allow that the possibility of the present may give way to a new and different reality than the one that we have experienced in the past. And I know that sounds so obvious, but it's actually the foundation of all effective spirituality. So I want to encourage you. Learn to read your life as a single shimmering sea whose glittering surface scatters light from one wave to the next. One of my favorite lyrics is that every ocean is just a drop of water. Wave upon wave, the undulating body is never the same, and yet patterns are so readily intelligible to those who know how to look. We all know what a wave looks like. Intertextuality and spirituality. Your life is meant to be read in relationship to itself, to the world in which it is unfolding. Darren encourages us to notice the effects of our practice. Usually after holding us in chair pose for an exceptionally long time, which means the first effect that most of us notice is our anger and bitterness towards the one who is leading our practice, which isn't very convenient for him. When we take intertextuality and spirituality together, I think, and I reflect on my own experience, I realize that these two ancient practices, yoga and communion, Holy Communion, the Eucharist, each illuminated the other in some brilliant and beautiful, some unexpected ways. First, and maybe most obviously, is that communion and yoga actually both have the same root, union, to be yoked together. Historically, we have understood approaching this table and receiving bread and wine not as a spiritual practice so much as a measure of our doctrinal fitness, used often to divide Christians into various camps. Unless you believe this or that about the bread and wine, then you're not welcome at this or that table, right? But what if historically we've completely missed the point? What if the most urgent question isn't how the bread and wine are changed, but how we are changed by entering into the spiritual discipline every single week? When I practice on Tuesdays, I feel my body sync with others. Pulse and breath, arms arcing in unison, straining to reach the height of the cathedral ceilings, hearts begin to open, turning toward heaven. And the ideas that we shared through quotes and reflection at the beginning, they cease to simply be conceptual themes. Moving through the bodily postures together, an unsolicited unity begins to well up, extending organically from within me and each other and moving out, touching something very real in all of us. There comes this moment, I think, in yoga where the difference between I and thou begins to fall away. It begins to blur. We become one body, knit together by the invisible ligaments of grace, connecting us across our differences to the joys and struggles that we all share as people moving through the world. It is cathartic and bonding. It is rhythmic and harmonious. As we return to our seats tonight, after receiving the bread and wine, as we do every week, I encourage you to take time for yourself. There's a beautiful project out there on the porch that Suki Bryan, our artist in residence, created for us. And it's waves, so that's pretty appropriate, since that's part of our theme tonight. And you can paint on that if you like. You may also simply sit and reflect. Take time. Notice the effects of your practice.